Good morning and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Cronk-Warner, and I have the privilege and honor of being Dean of the S.J. Quinney College of Law here at the University of Utah. My pronouns are she and hers, and anytime that we gather like this with people from across the country, I like to start with a tribal land acknowledgement statement, because at least where I'm coming to you from, which is the Salt Lake Valley here in Utah, used to be tribal land. And we here at the University of Utah acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Gauche, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And so it seems that we should be really appropriate that we are here today for this important community outreach activity and this important discussion, the discussion of abuse of athletes, and more particular, the fact that and how they are enabled by bystanders who continually allow for the abuse to continue. Now, unfortunately, we've heard over the last several years from several universities across the country instances where there have been individuals in power within those institutions who have abused athletes who tend to be perhaps more vulnerable to such abuse because there are certain things that they have to do by virtue of being athletes that subject them to the abuse of those in power. But what is consistent, the stories change, the person who is in power, the stories of the particular abuse might change. But what remains the same across all of these instances and allegations across the United States is that there is a system, an army of enablers that allows for this abuse to happen, and in many sad instances allows for it to continue unchecked. And so you will oftentimes hear athletes say it wasn't just the actual physical abuse that they suffered, but then they're further traumatized by the fact that these systems of power that exist within many university structures allowed for the abuse to continue, and even in some instances perhaps covered up the abuse. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. You're going to hear today stories of athletes from different institutions who suffered abuse, but then also suffered all of the ramifications that came along with these armies of enablers and these individuals in power within the institutions that they were students at that allowed either for the abuse to continue or simply didn't believe the student athletes and kind of tried to sweep it under the floor. So we're really going to focus on that consistent theme of these armies of enablers. And I want to acknowledge that today's conference would simply not be happening if not for Professor Amos Guerrera. So today's conference was inspired by his book, Armies of Enablers, which looks at this very issue, which looks at different allegations of abuse of athletes across the country. But again, this same systemic system of empowering enablers and systematic abuse that allows for the abuse to continue and does not address the abuse. And so that's what we're going to focus our comments on today. I'm really excited about today's conference. I think it's an excellent mix of, you're going to hear this morning to start from two survivors who come from two different institutions and they participated in two different types of athletics. But I think you're going to find and you're going to hear some similarities in their stories in that even though they competed in different types of athletics at different institutions, their stories are sadly familiar. And so I think that their stories are going to do a wonderful job of framing today's conference, because once we hear the power of their story, we can then move on in subsequent panels today to talk about the ethics of the issue. And also to talk about the legality of the issue, looking at it from a criminal perspective. And then our last panel of the day will really be forward-looking. Again, this challenge, this problem, this atrocity keeps on happening across the country. So what can we do to make sure that it doesn't happen anymore? Not just that the sexual abuse doesn't happen, but that this system or these systems, these armies of enablers, which allow and perpetuate this abuse, continue to no longer happen. And so we'll have a really forward-looking panel that will take a look at the issue from a multiple of different perspectives, from a legislative and policy perspective, to have our own athletic director here from the University of Utah to talk to about it from athletic director perspective, to really a psychological and clinical perspective, talking to somebody who specializes in the field. So I'm really excited about how today's conference will progress from the personal stories of those who survived to talking about why, of course, this is wrong from both an ethical and a legal perspective, to more of a forward-looking what we can do to address it and change the situation. Now, sadly, sexual assault is something that plagues our campus communities. I myself, before I had the privilege of becoming dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, was a domestic violence advocate. And of course, there's intersections between domestic violence and abuse. And I worked in a college campus community. And so I regularly worked with college students. And through my time as a domestic violence advisor, I found that the statistics of sexual assault on college campuses are just simply staggering. So in majority populations, so if we're talking about white heterosexual populations, some people believe that 1 in 5 women, people who identify as women, will be sexually assaulted during their time on campuses. And for men, it's 1 in 8. And I'm really excited that our first keynote perspective is going to talk about what it is to be a man who's been sexually abused, because sometimes I think we lose track of the fact that men suffer abuse in really high numbers. And those are the numbers for the majority population. When you start to get into smaller populations, more vulnerable populations, such as LGBTQ populations, transgendered populations, my own community, I am a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. It's anticipated that in some parts of Indian country, 1 in 2 women are survivors of sexual assault or abuse. And if you think about that, it's astounding that if you're in a room full of Native women, half of the people in that room could have been sexually abused or sexually assaulted or raped. And that's a really important statistic. And so I'm glad that we are talking about that and talking about what it means in our campus communities. Also, another important thing that I learned from my time as a domestic violence advocate is that 97% of the time, our survivors are telling the truth. 97% of the time. I think sometimes as society, we like to focus on the very, very rare instance when somebody is not telling the truth. But the vast majority of the time, our survivors are telling the truth. And so that's why we need to start from a place of believing our survivors and listening to their stories. My training tells me that if somebody can give you facts and tell you details, they are more than likely telling the truth. And sadly, I think you're going to hear some very detailed and startling stories today. So that's the other thing that I just want to remind us as we're moving through today's panels, that we need to start from a place of understanding and belief, because not just because it's the right thing to do, but statistically, we know that just overwhelmingly our survivors are telling the truth. So before we move into our keynote presentation, and again, we're going to start today's conference with 2 survivors who are going to tell their truth and are going to tell their story. I do want to thank our University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law, amazing IT and events team. You're not going to see them because they have their speakers and their video off, but they are here. And they have done just a fantastic job in setting up today's conference. And so I want to acknowledge them. Again, you're not going to see them, but I want to acknowledge them. Spencer Cope and Charlie Stewart, who have done so much for this conference in terms of logistics and pulling everything together. I also want to thank our development team members, Kevin Carrillo and Robbie Richter, who are also here, but have their video and their mute off. They have done a fantastic job of really helping to pull together these panels, and again, making sure that we address these issues from a multiplicity of perspectives. And last but not least, I want to thank our Director of Events, Chris Monty, who again is here, but has her video turned off and her mute turned off. She's kind of the woman behind the scenes who oversees it all and makes sure that we have a smooth conference today. So before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just want to give a couple of points to kind of lay the groundwork for today's conference. The first is I want to be very clear and to give everyone who may be attending a warning. We are going to talk about rape. And we are going to talk about sexual abuse. And while we certainly are not going to try to glorify it or add details, we are going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about it openly. And so I think that many of the things that we're going to talk about in today's conference could be difficult to hear, especially for anyone who may be a survivor themselves. And so we have with us Lauren Alsway, who is also going to be on the last panel, but she's going to be with us throughout the day. And so if anyone ever feels themselves getting triggered or getting upset because of today's content, please feel free to reach out, and she is here to support you. If you would like to speak with Lauren, who is a healthcare professional, you can see in the comments that she has given her phone number, which is area code 517. Excuse me, it just clicked off. 517-455-7171. Again, 517-455-7171. Or you can email her at lauren@northstarwc.com. Again, lauren@northstarwc.com. And we really appreciate Lauren being with us today, because not only is she a professional in this space and has very graciously agreed to help support anybody who may need to support throughout the panel, but she's also a survivor herself. So she has intimate knowledge of this system of abuse and then the system of the Armies of Enablers. So a big thank you to Lauren for being willing to support everyone today. And again, I do want to give a trigger warning that we are going to talk explicitly about rape and sexual abuse. And I think that that's really important in order to identify and parse out this important topic that we're talking about today. Also, I want to note that our keynote speaker, Jon Vaughn, is going to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour. While he's speaking, I'm going to turn my camera off and my microphone off, but I will still be here. And if you go to the bottom of your screen, you will see that there's a Q&A button. And so at any time, if you think of any questions for Mr. Vaughn, please feel free to put your questions into the question and answer box. And after he's done with his primary presentation, I will moderate questions. And please be respectful, again, because of the nature of what we're talking about today. Obviously, I will be only addressing respectful questions that are asked of Mr. Vaughn. But again, please feel free to use that Q&A button, and we will use the last 20 minutes or so for question and answer after he's given his presentation. So with those things in place, it is my absolute honor and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for today's panel, Jonathan Vaughn, who has led just a truly fantastic and amazing career. So he was not only a college athlete playing football for the University of Michigan, but he also played in the NFL for several teams for several years. So he had great success as an athlete, and he's gone on to have success in additional fields as an entrepreneur. And as I like in his bio, he also likes to mention that he is a father as well. I'm incredibly impressed and amazed by Mr. Vaughn and his courage to talk about what he experienced as a student athlete, and then also these systems of Armies of Enablers that allowed for the alleged abuse to continue and to be perpetuated. I had a chance to talk to Mr. Vaughn last evening, and he shared with me that this is the first time he is going to really share his story outside of a one-on-one situation, a more intimate situation. And so I really applaud him for his courage to come forward and to tell his story. But also I want to acknowledge the strength and the importance of his story. Many of us working in this field or related fields, such as myself in domestic violence, are probably familiar with those national statistics. But it's really these personalized stories and the people behind them who have the courage to tell the stories, that bring the stories to life, that give strength to power to the words. And so I really thank him for his courage and the story that he's going to tell us today. I also want to acknowledge that, as I shared earlier, I'm a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, which is located within Michigan. And sometimes when we share our stories, it brings tears or we get emotional. And so that might happen today. And I think that, of course, is perfectly appropriate. And in my tribe, we would say that anytime you get emotional or that you find yourself with tears in your eyes, that means that your ancestors are with us or with you. And so I have a feeling that our ancestors are going to be with us today as we talk about this important topic. And it's wonderful that they can be with us here today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jonathan Vaughn. Mr. Vaughn?
Good morning. Thank you, Dean Warner. Wow, there were so many things I wanted to say, and I had this opening prepared today. But I think I really want to concentrate on a theme of why. Why do athletes pursue the sports that they pursue? Why do people watch the sports they watch? And why do institutions turn a blind eye to abuse? I'll just start by giving a little background on myself. I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. My mother was a teacher. My father held several different jobs, from janitor to HR director and so forth. I only had one brother, and he was 14 months older. So he's been my best friend for the last 50 years, which is exactly how old I am today. A couple things that have really been stirring in my mind leading up to this conference. One, if a teammate and best friend hadn't emailed me in March of 2020, I wouldn't be here today, because I hadn't really thought about what my daily life was at the University of Michigan for over 30 years. Obviously, I left Michigan, moved on to the NFL, and then into my business and life as a father. But it was that email that started the fall of dominoes that took me on a journey all the way back to my childhood. And I think that it will give all of us a chance to really understand what my why was as it pertains to sport. So being the youngest, I was always trying to keep up with my big brother or older brother, big brother and older brother, since I could remember tagging along, working on my skills at different sports so that I could be picked on the same teams that he could. In that I was the kid that I was nerdy. I used to have to wear my key to my house around my neck on a shoestring for the better part of, until I was probably a sophomore in high school, because I would lose my key all the time. And my mother got to a point where she was like, you know what, you can't lose this key. But my love for sports started in the second grade when I was introduced to soccer. And I was able to play soccer all summer in a summer camp that my mother had sent my brother and I to. And then soon after that, I saw a guy named Pele. And that became my world. Soccer was my world. I played baseball. My mother wouldn't let us play tackle football at the time. So I really started having a love for sport and realizing that I actually might be pretty good at sports from playing soccer. That brought a lot of things into my life. One of the things that it brought into my life was bullying, because I was in a school where the majority of the students were Caucasian. I was most of the time the only African American child playing soccer at that time in St. Louis, as well as I was always the fastest in every school, but I was known from running from trouble and trying to find my brother. So growing up, I was different. I played alone a lot. And, I was in an environment at home where I had a very abusive father, a strong mother that really protected us as much as she could from the abuse. So sports was really, for me at that point, my why of just getting away from my father. And then once we would excel at sports, my brother and I would then, that would be the times that we would be praised or have good times, if you will, with my father. My father was a murderer. I have to, and I think about that often in the direction that I took as a child, because in the kindergarten, I saw my father and one of his friends get another gentleman killed in front of my brother and I. And that's when I had a mortal fear of my father most of the time growing up, which led into I started to be harassed by an older kid in the neighborhood around the fourth grade, and in summer between seventh and eighth grade. That's when that harassment went from verbal to physical. It was the first time that I was raped, and then subsequently raped violently over the next 5 or so years, passed around to men that were 2 to 3 times my age. And at this time, everything that I liked was out of the realm of what my father grew up doing. Sports wise, playing the piano, all the instruments, the guitar and whatnot. So I knew that I couldn't tell my father. So that was really my, childhood. I actually started playing football my sophomore year in high school because the number one bully that I had for at least a year and a half, 2 years, was the starting running back and starting tailback on the football team. And the only way I knew to combat him was to leave the soccer team for my high school to then play just pickup games or indoor soccer or whatnot, and to go out for football and to compete with him to get him to stop bullying me. Because I was a quiet kid, didn't, kind of aloof in a lot of ways. School actually was a kind of a respite from the oppression that I was dealing with at home. And funny thing is the third football practice of my life, this gentleman or this boy that was bullying me, he quit. And so the head coach of the sophomore team comes to me and said, "Well, I guess you are our starting running back and starting free safety." And hence my football career began. While I was playing football, I still loved soccer. The only games I would watch in football growing up was the Super Bowl. Ironically, I would try to find soccer games. I remember when Pele came to the United States with the New York Cosmos. So I used to just try to watch as much soccer as I could. We had an indoor soccer team that won the championship in St. Louis, so I'd go to those games. And, I've got a ball in my feet. almost as much as I could remember as a child. Going into my senior year of college, my junior year, I got a lot of recruiting letters and whatnot, but my why at that point was to get out of school and go to Europe and play soccer. And in the fall of 1987, which was my senior year, my mother contracted breast cancer. My brother's away at school at the University of Pennsylvania playing football. And I remember my mother sitting me down, and she made a comment to my aunt who had come from Delaware that, if something should happen to me, I've gotten my sons to college. That was probably the most shocking statement I think I'd heard at that point in my life, because my mother being a teacher, I hadn't even told her that I wasn't going to college, that I was going to pack a bag and find a way to Europe. That's another point in my life where my why changed. I had to get serious about football. I had to get serious about the recruiting process. And I had to get serious about, fulfilling one of my mother's dreams. So that fall, I took the ACT, the SATs, passed those, and really got engaged in the recruiting process. My life changed. Toward the end of the year, there was a gentleman that had on these tan and blue kind of nubuck shoes and a navy blue shirt, coat, and he was at practice. And that gentleman was Les Miles. And he not only was the interior offensive line coach at the University of Michigan, but he'd also played at the University of Michigan. And as I got to know him in the recruiting process, which back in 1987 was nothing like it is today, didn't have all the media coverage. We would go to, we'd have lunch together. We would have dinner together. He would come to my house. He would meet my parents. But he really spoke to me about the value of me. And at that time in my life, the only value that anyone put on my life was what Jon Vaughn did on the field. And I say that because, my mother gave me the name Jonathan Stewart Vaughn, but me being just a imaginative kid, I wanted a 2-syllable name like Pele. So I wanted to be called Jon Vaughn when it came to sport. And I felt like not only did Jon Vaughn attract Les Miles and the University of Michigan amongst all the other schools that I was recruiting by, from Oklahoma to Notre Dame to UCLA, Florida. But he wanted to get to know Jonathan Vaughn as well as Jon Vaughn. And that really struck a chord. And I knew that my new why, I think, would be supportive. So, that's my why, getting up to 18 years old. I get on the campus, and bear with me, and I tell this story because there's two distinctions that I want everyone to understand. That my why, once I got on campus and we talked about it and coaches talked about it, was two different things. One, it was about becoming a Michigan man, and that going through the program and playing for Bo Schembechler, you would become a Michigan man because you would be tested mentally, physically, emotionally. You would learn how to put the team first, and you would be a model student. And then I learned a principle when I was 18 that I carried and still carry today. And it was in the first team meeting that Bo Schembechler ever spoke to the entire team after we started training camp. And he says, you know, men, there's one thing that I teach you at this university is every day a man gets better or worse, he never stays the same. And hopefully during your time in Michigan, we have more better days than worse days. And if we do, we'll win a lot of games. We'll win the Big Ten and we'll play in the Rose Bowl. And I've done my job. So early on, my why became the team and becoming a Michigan man. And to address a question that has been asked more times than I think I can count since March of 2020 is, how does a large elite athlete suffer sexual abuse and rape? Well, I'm going to tell you how. So in my first time I met Dr. Anderson, who was the team physician at the University of Michigan. And he says to me, you know, how are you doing? I give him my name. You know, I tell him my name is Jon Vaughn. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I play running back. We do all the typical you know, blood pressure, heart rate, all my vitals, height, weight. And then he proceeds to tell me that, you know, we're now going to do a testicular exam, testing for any abnormalities, as well as we're going to check and make sure that you don't have any hernias. So he asked me to drop my pants, and got, you know, very close because he was sitting on the stool. I'm standing with my shorts down at that point, and he gives me a testicular exam. Then he proceeds to move to the next phase of the exam, where he says, we're now going to do a rectal exam and a prostate exam. Now, mind you, I'm 18 years of age. I know what testicles are. I had never even heard of a prostate. So he asked me to lay on the table, bring my knees to my stomach, and he proceeds to insert 2 fingers into my rectum. Move them around, you know, feel for different things. At the end of that exam, you know, all he said was, you know, clean yourself up, go get to practice. The thing about those exams back then, this doctor really didn't have much of a bedside manner. If you would have seen him in a lineup of coaches and players, you might not even recognize him. But all the exams that I went through, now distinctly 42, and there's about 8 that just aren't that clear to me. In my 3 years at Michigan, always heard the words, we're going to do a testicular exam as well as a prostate exam. And I tell this because that's the how. That's how I was able to suffer digital insertion and the funneling up, you know, in my rectum and the funneling of my testicles and penis for 40 plus times while I was at the University of Michigan, because 100% of those exams were under the guise of medical treatment. And they were not just medical treatment for exams, your physicals, they were medical treatment for when I had strep throat, when I had food poisoning, when I started to get an ulcer. If there was anything you needed stronger than naproxen or Advil, you had to see this doctor. We were forbidden to see any other doctor first, but Dr. Anderson, for whatever medical treatment we needed. And so when you're 18, your why is to never go back home. Your why is to make your mother proud. Your why is to represent your family. Your why is to be a Michigan man. And your why is to do whatever it takes to get on the field, to wear the winged helmet, and to have your name called in front of 100-something thousand people. That is your why. And so the interesting thing is I didn't really even know my why that I was going to be. I remember when Dean Warner and Amos discussed with me about being a part of this conference. And at that point, my why was just trying to understand how I just became a center, or one of the figures, one of the anonymous figures of what will go down to date as the largest, most insidious sexual abuse, molestation, rape, and cover up in the history of sports. My wife was just trying to understand, how did this happen to me? How does, or why does, more importantly, when you go back and think about the recruiting process or the allure of the organization when it comes to attracting athletes, why do you go into the homes to speak to the parents and make statements about they will be protected? You've done a great job, Mother X or Father X, but now I'm going to help your son become a man. When they're looking for you for guidance. A lot of times in sports, and especially at like elite levels of sport, very often your coaches and your teammates at times become closer to you than your family, because that's all you're spending time with. And so at 50 years of age, looking back on what I thought were the foundations and the lessons that I learned that carried me into manhood, several of them were built on a foundation of lies and cover up. I've, since come to realize, and I just have to thank Lauren for this, in a conversation, not knowing, not having real empathy for abuse in athletes, because the only abuse at that point in my life that I think about is how we wouldn't drink water. You wouldn't be the first person to drink water because you didn't want to, be perceived as soft. Or, you get your bell rung, sniff some smelling salt and move out. But in the conversation, and I was in coming to the realization that I'd been a victim repeatedly, and duped in a lot of ways, totally different from what I had experienced as a child. I was explaining to learn that, it was just prostate exams. Um, it was just all under medical treatment. And it was just, a weird doctor. And she stopped me and she made a comment about, Jon, I'm not going to diminish what you've gone through, but rape is rape. And I think we need to understand better, and we need to become more sympathetic and empathetic to the sacrifice that athletes make of not only their entire body, but also their mind and their heart, because they love these institutions that if your body is truly your temple, these organizations do not have the right to continually desecrate them. And I say that from the standpoint of, there was a time for about a month that I felt like a victim. And well, really a couple months. And I'll tell you when that changed for me. That changed for me one day in July of 2020, where I've been doing research about, and I don't know if you all know what's, kind of going on at the University of Michigan, but in February, just briefly, and a letter came out, or an article came out in the Detroit News by Kim Kozlowski that basically enlightened the world on the cover up that had been going on at University of Michigan, and the atrocities that were committed by Dr. Anderson, and how these atrocities had gone on for his entire tenure, which was 40 plus years. But these atrocities had gone on for 5 decades. Now, mind you, I turned 50 March the 12th of 2020. I found out about this on March the 26th of 2020. So in that time of finding out, I went through some very low periods because I just couldn't believe that so many men that I trusted, not only deceived me, but deceived my teammates. Because I think, and the blessing of this is I've had more conversations with teammates that I hadn't talked to in 30 years, catching up, finding out about their lives, but realizing that this trauma that we're realizing now some 30 years later, it's truly trauma and we need to deal with it. And so I've started having panic attacks because what I noticed, not only in this case, but in other cases, Michigan State, Catholic Church, that there was a term that was placed on victims that I really couldn't understand why. And that was the term John Doe or Jane Doe, which in my mind, the only time I've ever really paid attention to a Jane or John Doe is when somebody had passed. But I started to realize that the way the legal system is set up and how these institutions use the Jane and John Doe, the faceless, the nameless, the voiceless, on their behalf, because we're talking about Goliath organizations. And I'm not even a David at this point. I'm a John Doe. And then they start to separate you from the organizations that not only you helped to build, but that you represented physically, mentally, monetarily, for your time that you were there and afterwards. And so back to July of this year, I doing research on the internet, and I find an article about a book called Armies of Enablers. I've always been interested in war and generals and history. So I was like, Armies of Enablers. All right, I got to check this out. And so I email Amos Giora, and start the email not knowing anything about this gentleman. It's like, hi, my name is Jon Vaughn. I played at the University of Michigan. I don't know if you know about what's going on at Michigan, but I would love to talk to you because I've got some questions and I am confused. I immediately get an email back, and Amos like, Amos in his whole Amos way, he's like, hell yeah, I remember you. Like, I lived in Ann Arbor. I've had season tickets, and my dad was a professor. And at that point in time, I had comfort, but I also had trepidation because he was a part of the Michigan community. And I had already started to be kind of cut out of things at Michigan. So we get on the phone, or we get on Skype, I think. And I would say that was the day that changed my life and my perspective as it pertains to, abuse of athletes. Not only looking at it from an athletic standpoint, but looking at it from a cultural standpoint, economic standpoint, and also looking at the depth of cover-ups and enablements that these universities and these organizations have tens of people knowing that these atrocities are going on, and they do everything in their power to protect one individual. I needed to know why, after the powers that be knew about this doctor, why was I even introduced to this doctor in 1988? I needed to know that. And that started a series of conversations with Amos that, I try to tell him in the only way that I can, like, you helped me out of a very dark place. I was like, the one thing about being an athlete is you remember the moments where your career changes, the moments where you become an authority at your sport, authority in your position. And I told him, I was like, I've searched more pages on the internet than probably most. And I know far more than most of my teammates. But your book and what you're discussing is the first step in erasing this insidious culture in sports. And we had some laughs on the call, but we ended that call with 2 charges. One, I told him that I'm willing to go to the end. And 2, we're probably not going to be invited to many dinner parties in Ann Arbor. And that was something that we were willing to endure. Now, I'll say this, and I'm not placing blame, but I've watched really closely since Penn State and what happened at Michigan State. And I read this quote that I think sums up the survivor, let's just call it the David and Goliath, the David versus Goliath. And George Orwell said, the further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those that speak it. Having that conversation with Amos, reading that quote, the support of my brother, the support of my friends, the support of my teammates, who some of the most powerful, respected men I've ever met that could only say me too. And you are our captain now. My why changed. My why is what brings me here today. And I want everyone, if they can, before they go to sleep tonight, I want you to look into your mirror. Sorry. Because this is what I do every night. I look into that mirror and I say, I am not John Doe. I am Jon Vaughn. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Jon. What amazing words and power, and your truth. And we've really appreciated your vulnerability and willingness to share with us today. And I see, as we say in my tribe, I see that your ancestors are with you. And so I'm really glad that they can be with you to support you as you share with us, and as you hopefully through your story help to change and break down those power structures that led to not only the physical abuse that you've suffered, but also your discussion of kind of the mental and emotional abuse as you were separated from your family and your community. So we really applaud you for your vulnerability and your courage. And thank you for sharing your story. So we have a little bit more time for questions. For those of you who are in the audience, Mr. Vaughn has graciously agreed to answer your questions. Again, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. And if you type in your question there, I will be moderating the questions, but we do, of course, ask that you try to keep your questions respectful given the sensitivity of the topic. So our first statement comes from Joanna, who says, Jon, not a question, just a message from a Brazilian Olympic swimmer who relates to your history and is also a survivor from sexual abuse by my coach at age 9. Thanks for sharing your history. Thanks for not giving up on life. So I think Joanna speaks for all of us and all survivors when she says that she really appreciates your willingness to share and to bring voice to these stories. Next, we have a question from Laura Dunn, who says that she, if you'd be willing to, would appreciate if you could talk a little bit about toxic masculinity and how it interrelates with sports.
Wow. I think we, as male athletes, think of ourselves, and I say this kind of tongue in cheek, but you get this God complex. And I think maybe because I've actually seen this, where you feel like you are strong enough to run through a wall, and I've watched teammates run through walls. And if we are all animals still, even though, we have this carnal nature and we have this testosterone, and we have, in a lot of ways, you have a mob mentality that when you are so driven to perform, to push your body to a level that most can't understand, that energy and that adrenaline, if not channeled correctly, starts to bleed out into other areas of your life. And I think that there is an overdose of endorphins and adrenaline and testosterone that we're constantly redlining. And that energy needs to be dispersed because, you know, in physics, right? So energy is never disappears, it's just dispersed. And I think we need to better prepare athletes, you know, for that dispersion of energy, because it's like going into battle, obviously not war, but you go into battle and where you tune out everything and you can't just shut it off. And we don't have the right tools until there's a problem that happens, right? We're not, we don't proactively, as just in general in sports, we treat ailments. We don't really treat why we have those ailments. We don't, it's like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of pain. We don't study the behavior of the 24-hour cycle of an athlete's life, because an athlete's life is only important for when it has the number on its back, when it's in meeting, when it's in games or practice. And I think that macho, toxic culture of always have to be the toughest, never showing weakness, I think has had catastrophic damage, not only outwardly in how you deal with the world, but I also have seen that destroy men internally. So I think it's definitely a problem. It's very interesting that you would even ask that question, because I don't think I've even heard the term toxic masculinity in at least 10 years, but we see it every day. So it's something that I think definitely we need to really understand the psychological demands and the psychological impact of being an athlete, just in general.
Thank you. And I have to just adding from my personal experience, I have a 4-year-old son, and it was shocking to me how early people would make statements to him like, oh, you need to man up and don't cry, just shake it off. You're a strong boy. And so just how early in society we began socializing boys and men with this idea that they can't have feelings and can't have emotions. It's something I've personally seen with my son happening very early on. So I appreciate Jon's comments on that. Seth has a comment. He says, Jon, you are a hero and an amazing role model. I am awed by your bravery and your composure. I have to say, I definitely agree with Seth. Eric also says, I do not have a question, but I would like to express my love and appreciation to you, Jon, for sharing your story. Very powerful. I agree. Next, we have Sashi says, it is a very emotional, heartfelt story of Jon Vaughn's life, who suffered sexual abuse, mental trauma. I really felt bad how in sports such bad things are happening, how to rectify this exploitive and abusive social structure, torture during medical examination. This is from Sashi Kumar, who's coming to us from India. So thank you, Sashi, for sharing. And thank you for joining us from India, too. I have a feeling it's probably quite late there. So thank you for making the time. Next, we have somebody who's joining us from Jerusalem, Israel. This is Ruth, who says, thank you from Jerusalem, Israel, for your honesty. You are being such a strong, tough, cool guy. You will give courage to other young adolescents to say, no, something is wrong here, and you are amazing. So thank you, Ruth, also for joining us and all the way from Jerusalem. And again, I have a feeling it's probably quite late. So thank you for joining us. Next, we have excuse for my language, but in professional sport or education in college or universities, aren't there counseling? So I think this is somebody whose English is a second language saying, were there any counseling services that the University of Michigan offered you? Any support? Anything at all that University of Michigan offers you, either while you were a student athlete or perhaps after you graduated?
So as a student athlete, there's the sports side of college sports, and then there's the business side. Let's say it's making sure you're in class, making sure you have health, whatever. And so in our era, and I say, like, in the 1980s, sports were a lot different in how they were run than they are today. We didn't necessarily have counselors. We had academic advisors. You would have a couple guys that you could speak with, but we were so trained on never showing weakness. And what you've also got to understand about this situation at Michigan specifically, which is the only one I intimately know, is this doctor had his office in the football facilities. So your life as a student ended when you walked in that football facility. So whatever went on there, whatever happened in that facility, whether it's the doctors, the trainers, the practice, or whatnot, it was all for one goal, and that is to win football games. And first you do that by getting into practice. Several guys that I've talked to outside of the era that I played in or that were not teammates talked about Dr. Anderson was your last, checklist to be able to practice. Because if you didn't practice, you didn't play. So I didn't experience, like, I would have never talked to, now I'll tell you a story. I remember, this is going into my redshirt sophomore year. And this is why I never really talked to the coaches about personal stuff. I had a break at the end of the school year. My mother wasn't feeling well. I had gone home for Memorial Day. And we were supposed to be back on that Tuesday for conditioning. I was in the summer, summer sessions. And I didn't come back for like a week. Just decided to spend some more time with my mother. I couldn't, we didn't have the means for me to fly back home a lot on breaks. Never went home on Thanksgiving because we always played Ohio State the day after or the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Never went home on Christmas because we were playing in bowl games. So it was the first time I ever really went outside the norm and did something for myself, if you will, outside of the team construct. And just 2 nights ago, one of my best friends and teammates, he was like, you realize that they didn't want us to do what was good for us. They only wanted us to do what was good for them, no matter what the sacrifices. So you're in this environment where you're afraid to even admit pain. And mental pain was the worst type of pain, because the first thing that they try to do is they break you down mentally to remove everything that you know from your past sport life, to just be instinctual on your talent, but you're going to do it the Michigan way. So in a lot of ways, it's very militaristic, and you're constantly under fire So you have no time to take a step back and, kind of lick your wounds. Now, the system has changed over the last 50 years, just by looking at how lavish the facilities and the locker rooms are now for kids. And I'm sure that as mental health has become more prevalent in the last couple of years, yes, but for us, no. We didn't have the opportunity to really, there's two ways to rule. And you either rule by love or you rule by fear. Michigan at that point was ruled by fear. It was fear of not being able to live up to the Michigan man moniker. And a Michigan man is a man that has no fear. A Michigan man is a man that has no quit. A Michigan man is the man that will sacrifice his mind, his body, his spirit for the man playing next to you or of those 100 men that are in that locker room. So that's just an example of me dealing with, and thank God I never had guys whose parents might have passed or whatnot while I've been in school or knew about it. But if spending time with my mother who's recuperating from cancer gets me, I don't know, maybe I was suspended for like 2 weeks or something like that. You just knew that you really couldn't share a lot with your coaches because it's all about, there is no off season. Every year we play Notre Dame, Michigan State, and Ohio State. And everything you do needs to track to those games. Make sure that because the moniker of student athlete is kind of a hypocrisy because as a football player, I couldn't even take classes that ended after 1 p.m. And for all of you who have gone to college, you know that it's the afternoon colleges that you're more productive because who wants to get up at 8 o'clock for classes as an 18-year-old, right? So I hope that answers your question. I'm sure there are, mental health has become more prevalent in the last couple of years. And I think men are able to talk about it. But in my days, if you didn't talk to your roommate, you didn't talk to anyone.
Wow, thank you for that. And that's why I think your story is so incredibly impactful and important because we do want to talk about mental health and we do want to talk about wellness. And I think your bravery in being willing to share what happened to you and opening that door to say, it's okay. As a man, you could be raped. As a Black man, you could be raped, and let's talk about it, I think is incredibly powerful. And I do want to point out for those of you who are looking in the Q&A, Layla Ames has identified herself as being on the call, and she is the U of U's, the University of Utah student athlete advocate. And she says that her role is intended to provide student athletes a trusted resource outside of the athletics department to hopefully prevent instances of abuse, particularly systemic abuse. So I think if anybody has any questions for her or the role that she plays as student athlete advocate, she has identified herself, so there might be an opportunity to ask questions of her through the Q&A. Also that question of how have things perhaps changed since the late 80s, early 90s, in terms of providing mental health support for our student athletes might be a good question for Mark Harlan, who's our athletic director here at the University of Utah, and he is on the last panel of the conference. And so that might be a good question for us to come back to at the very end of the conference when he presents. So Mr. Vaughn, we have a question here from Annie Knox, who does identify herself as a reporter. She is from the Deseret News, which is one of our newspapers here in Utah. And she says, what do you believe needs to happen for institutions to be held accountable? Does the current legal system allow for accountability, allow for that?
That's a good question. I think from a legal perspective, that might be better I mean, Amos, you might be better to answer that question. What I think needs to happen is the governing body, which is the NCAA, on their website, they talk about the number one goal, or one of the top goals, is the protection of student athletes. But yet, and you can look this up, sometime in the summer of 2020, they argued in federal court that the NCAA has no duty or responsibility to protect student athletes and abuse. So, and it's something that Amos and I talk about in not only the writing of our book, but in championing this cause, is the institution, the conferences, the NCAA, all of the partners need to be made aware and need to be accountable, because at the end of the day, the why for Michigan, for the Big Ten, for the NCAA is money. That's why they have the media partners they have. That's why they have the sponsors they have. It's all about protecting the brand to protect the revenues. Because what you can see in universities that play big time sports, let's just talk about the Power Five, because I'm not going to speak of all universities, but the more successful that marketing engine is, which is most of the time college football, the endowments of those universities go up. So you're looking at a system that is not being governed by its partners, not being governed by its conferences, and not being governed by the institution of NCAA sports as a whole. So I think the only way that you change is, and I hope I'm answering your question, is in a lot of ways you got to burn the whole system down and start it over. Not meaning that you stop playing sports, not meaning that these schools get the death penalty, but you have to build and harassment, abuse, outside structure to govern these institutions. And what's happening, I know in Utah and Michigan, is you have to get the state legislature to also, because a lot of these institutions are government employed or public institutions of those states, you have to work at the legal aspect as well. There has to be ramifications for bystander accountability, for bystander complicity. There has to be laws that govern doctors, whether that's during, after, or years after, that their medical treatment masks the abuse that they committed. And then one of the things that I told Amos, it's about 4 or 5 days ago, I said, we will have success when we're not having another one of these conferences, and when we've gone and sat on the floor on the Capitol and instituted US federal laws. Because what's happening, and I'm not an attorney, but you're flying from state to state and country to country, and you're abusing these athletes. So you're committing crimes across boundaries. So there should be federal jurisdiction. And then moreover, is there needs to be a world sport abuse, rape, molestation organization. Because if you have organizations like the US Olympic Committee and the NFL and soccer and all of these other institutions, and then we're hearing from people around the world, we need to get the world behind changing how we govern sport. That's the only way it will change. And it's like I talked to Amos. I was like, Amos, I hope I have at least another 30 years on the back nine of my life because I buried this for 30 years, didn't even think about it. Well, now you've woken the sleeping giant, so I need something to do. Because I look at no one was there, sadly, to protect the guys that I came in with. But somebody can be there for the guys that come in a decade, in 2021 or 2022 or 2050. So it's going to take time, but you need time and people to create anything that is a legacy. So we must have more conferences like this. We must have more open dialogue. From a cultural standpoint, Black athletes need to speak up and be honest. And the only way at a human level, the only way we have trust is if we have vulnerability. Because if I'm not vulnerable, I will never have trust. And we've got to gain the trust back of this competing structure of athletes versus the institution versus the NCAA versus the networks versus the sponsors. When at the end of the day, if all of you talk about the well-being of the athlete, then we need to put the athlete back as a priority of safety. Everything has been skewed because of the money, which is the why.
I really like that message of centering the athlete in all that we do. And I also think your point about the impact of the regulating body is an incredibly important one. We'll probably focus a lot on colleges and universities throughout the day, but your point about the role of the NCAA is well taken, because anytime you have a regulating body, whatever they're regulating, of course, the colleges and universities will follow. So I think that's a really poignant point. And also your point about the importance of legislation, both state and federal. That is an issue that we will also address on that last question, as we'll have a representative who'll come and talk to us about some potential legislation moving forward. So kind of in that forward-looking panel. Next, we have a question from an anonymous attendee who says that he or she loves that you look in the mirror each day and affirm your name. It has to be powerful to confirm your identity. Can you maybe speak a little bit to how that helps you heal every day?
So there's two fronts. You grow up as an athlete identified by your number first, because that's the easiest way to identify you, as well as my name really is the only thing that I can give you, in my actions, in my conversations, in my performance. I like that's my identifier. And the hardest thing, I think, and I've learned this, just understanding, abuse, is you feel alone. And it's almost like you're walking through like the old cartoons and it's raining over your head and it's always dark. And there are two factors that play in what affects you, I think, on a personal level, is either people haven't experienced abuse or people have experienced abuse, but they don't want to admit it. So there's this lack of empathy. So you feel like you're alone. And just that chant, and sometimes I said it loudly, sometimes I said it, just whispered it to myself, but I wasn't going to let anything, but specifically what happened to me at Michigan, take who I was away. And so in a lot of ways, I'm just keeping my mind strong through, I mean, it's, there was a marriage of sorts. And to find out after 30 years that everything that I thought was true and pure wasn't. And I think, but that's the beauty about sport, is when you let a sport become so pure and so organic to who you are, it allows you to perform at the highest level of your ability. So I was trying to get back to that Jon Vaughn, who was 3 years into playing football, 5'9", 178 pounds, soaking wet, faster than lightning, but I'm playing guys that are bigger, stronger, tougher, meaner. I was a soccer player. And I had to say to myself every day that I'm going to do something to take that number off my back and to give myself a name, that they will know who Jon Vaughn was, on why. You're constantly in this perpetual state of making you not regret recruiting you. So I want to get back to that guy, if you will. And that's, that saved my life. Not that, and never discount suicide. Never thought about suicide, but I definitely was existing, wasn't living, wasn't feeling. I was pretty numb to a lot of this, and disbelief and confused. And it brought me back to, the man that that sits before you today.
That's incredibly powerful. And I do want to acknowledge that we got a comment in from an anonymous attendee that said that he or she would like to applaud your strength, determination, and resilience. May your voice of courage offer hope and healing to others. And I certainly agree with that. We've gotten a couple of questions, and so I'm going to go ahead and combine them that ask essentially the same thing. So one is, do you think there is something that fans, students, and/or individuals can do to better help prevent abuse? And then several people ask if you think there's something that the universities could and should do to better prevent the abuse. So is there anything that us as individuals can do? And then what should universities be doing to help prevent the abuse?
From an individual standpoint, which now I'm a fan, right? So I'm speaking to myself, is if you follow a sport, if you follow a team, learn everything you can about that team, the good and the bad, and speak up for misdoings. Hold those brands accountable. Don't let them just run, in a lawless society. Hold them accountable. Write to the papers. We have, speak about it on social media. I mean, the individual has more power in its voice now than ever, and use those mediums to keep, the sports and the organizations that you love honest. You got to understand something. Like, I find out about this when it comes to the University of Michigan, is because there were not only in a cover up, but there had been 4 different cover ups that are very distinct in my mind. So the hardest thing to do as men and women, is it's easy to do the right thing when everybody's watching. It's harder to do the right thing if you know nobody will ever find out. So the institution, 0 tolerance. The minute you find out about abuse, you cut it out like a cancer. That, because, and as Amos will speak to later, all of these levels of enablement or like tentacles that all cross, and it becomes more energy to cover up the abuse while it's happening, because of the collateral damage goes on for years, and then more and more parts of the organization are involved in this conspiracy, when if there was a zero tolerance that abuse is happening, that's, that's how universities should act. Universities should not cover up. Universities, in the case of Michigan, should not hire the attorney in the law firm that represents Jeffrey Epstein. Universities should not ignore letters from athletes who say they were abused. Universities should not admit that those atrocities possibly happened until after it comes out in the newspaper. Universities should not marginalize, dehumanize, villainize people that were victims. Because what I will say, and I can't speak for every person that has suffered abuse or rape, but in the numerous ones that I've talked about, every incident, a part of you dies. So there has to be a hard line when it comes to institutions, that the abuser and anyone who enables the abuse is eradicated from that system immediately. Because as a student athlete, this is the thing that blows my mind, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, but as a student athlete, we have a code of conduct. If I had committed even close to the atrocities that happened at Michigan, I would have lost my scholarship. I'd have been kicked out of school immediately. Bo had a zero tolerance policy, at least while I was there. So the universities must, if you're going to have the audacity to have a code of conduct in which I, as a student athlete, must adhere to, you have to be able, because what are we doing? I mean, we're teaching the youth. Like we're talking about teenagers, and there's a responsibility as a competent adult to not manipulate the situation when you've got young lives at stake. And the numbers, and I meant to bring this up. I saw Dr. Anderson specifically. I'm now up to 42 times. And it's blurry for about 5 to 8. So anywhere from 42 to 50 times in my life. In a 3-year period, I had 42 testicular and penis exams under the guise of, I want to make sure you don't have a hernia and testicular cancer, showing no signs and coming in not just for a physical. And I had 42 prostate exams. There's no reason that any doctor will tell you, unless there are pre-existing conditions, that I had that many exams. And I started to talk to athletes, and I started to do the numbers. And we're potentially talking about, and Amos and I go in detail and think about this in our book and have checked and rechecked, but we're talking about a man over the course of a 50-year period of time that initiated 30,000 plus incidences of abuse, molestation, and rape. Now let that sink in. Literally just let that sink in. That's why it should be a zero tolerance. Because you allowed a man to affect, in the case of Michigan, potentially close to 7,000 student athletes and countless other athlete or students at that university. Just let that sink in. That's longer than I've been alive.
Wow, that's incredibly poignant. And my heart is racing. I can feel the physical impact of your words on my body as I take it in and process it. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I think that that's a wonderful note and kind of call to action, which is to have a zero tolerance policy at universities and to also really expect the same of our institutions that we expect of our student athletes. And so if we expect that our student athletes are going to meet a code of conduct, it only seems fair and natural that we would expect the same of our institutions and our universities. Please join me. I apologize, we didn't get a chance to ask all the questions, but oh my goodness, Jon Vaughn, that was an amazing presentation. And I know it's kind of difficult in this virtual format to see, but we had 175 participants on this call, which is phenomenal. And I am seeing just an outpouring of support and so many people that have said that your words have really touched them today, have really made them think, and you've really brought power to your story. And this is just a wonderful way to start our conference. And so thank you for sharing your vulnerability, for sharing your story, and for educating us about what this abuse looks like, at least in your experience with the University of Michigan. I do want to remind everybody before...
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. I do want to remind everybody before we take our break that Lauren, again, who is a survivor herself, but also trained counselor, a trained healthcare professional, has made herself available throughout this conference. So if anybody would benefit from talking to a professional, please, throughout the day, feel free to reach out to her. Her contact information is in the chat box, but just by way of reminder, her phone number is area code 517-455-7171, and her email is lauren@northstarwc.com. So again, thank you to Mr. Vaughn. We will now take a brief break. We'll take a 10-minute break, and we will reconvene at 10:30 when we will hear from Professor Amos Guerrera and also Tiffany Thomas Lopez, who is a survivor from Michigan State University. So again, Mr. Vaughn, thank you so much. To our attendees, thank you. And I look forward to our next panel in about 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you all.